The inspiration for this dish might have come from a little bit of an odd source, but what I ended up with was Mapo tofu, Kimchi Jjigae, so who really cares where it came from? This stuff is delicious. Now, as far as Mapo tofu goes, I've made it more times than I can count, but I don't have much experience with Korean stews. Y'all will indulge me, I'm gonna plug my buddy's book for a second. He didn't ask for this, but I always cite my sources, and the way that I learned how to make a jjigae is through Eric Kim's book, Korean American. Combining these two dishes wasn't particularly hard since I feel like spiritually Korean and Szechuan dishes go hand in hand. But the main challenge that comes from fusing two dishes such as these is simply making sure that you retain enough of each one's iconic character so that they're easily recognizable and distinct, but at the same time form a whole and cohesive dish. What that meant to me was that I would follow Eric's lead and use larger pieces of pork belly instead of the traditional ground pork belly, well, traditional to me anyway, but still cook them with Szechuan peppercorns along with the Gochugaru and salt. Here's a side quest. Do you like side quests? I like side quests. Still having half of the pork belly left, I had no idea what to do with it. And I had almost 6 quarts of chopped chilies that I also didn't know what to do with. I've never heard of anyone brining pork belly in Doubanjiang, but we will see what happens. Now, with the pork belly that you are going to use, cut off the skin and as much of the fatty part as you can and then cube it. Eric doesn't call for you to do this in his book, but since we're adding chili oil to the dish later on, we don't want there to be too much fat in the soup. Unlike the actual Mapo tofu dish, this will actually taste fine if you remove the pork and make it vegetarian or vegan. Anytime someone tries to make that dish vegetarian or vegan just by removing the ground pork and thinking that's okay, always ends up with something that doesn't taste good. Not saying that it's impossible, it's just not that easy. Anyways, grate your garlic. I also use this thing for grated ginger, it's fantastic. Unlike a microplane, this does not wear out at all. I've had this thing for years. Now give the pork belly a little toss in this garlic along with some gochugaru, some salt, as well as the Szechuan peppercorns, which I did toast and process in a mortar. To marry the flavors, I gave everything a nice little stir fry in the wok, but you can use a pan or you can use the pot that you're originally gonna cook everything in. The important thing here is to keep things moving and not get things too hot. You don't want to scorch any of the spices that are in there. That means not scorching the gochugaru or the Szechuan peppercorns. Those are the things that are most in danger of burning. You can see because the Szechuan peppercorn was previously toasted, I actually added in at the very last because those are in most danger of burning, and those will be very, very bitter if you actually burn them. Now, in his book, Eric states that a good kimchi is very important to a kimchi jjigae, but he also said store-bought was fine, and all I have is store-bought, so hey, work. But to add to this a little homemade funkiness, and also as an excuse to marry Korean pickled vegetables with Chinese pickled chilies, I decided to give the kimchi a little toss in some duojiao that I had made. Just like with the kimchi, duojiao can be purchased at the store in a jar. I think it is this combination of duojiao and kimchi that makes it so that if I remove the pork belly from the dish and made this vegan, it would be totally fine. There is a really great amount of depth that these two things combined add to the stew. At this point, it was pretty easy and everything happened really fast. All you really need to do is just bring the stew to a boil for 10 minutes, and that is long enough to cook the pork belly all the way through. What I ended up doing was bringing it to a boil, realizing that I hadn't made any rice, turned it off, and then brought it to a boil again an hour later after the rice was ready. So who knows if that had done anything, but either way, it was still delicious. Now, that jarred paste was the last major substitution that I had made into the stew. While Eric's recipe called for the use of Gochugaru, most of the flavor that you recognize in Mapo tofu comes from a paste called Doubanjiang. But unlike Gochugaru, this doesn't have the signature sweetness that you normally associate with it. It is unapologetically salty and spicy, and I think that layer will be the defining characteristics of what makes this dish different. At this point, we're going to bring it to a boil first so that the pork is cooked all the way through, and then for the second simmer, we will add the cubed and rinsed tofu. I'm doing this so the tofu doesn't break down over longer periods of boiling. I don't really know if it's an actual thing, it just made sense in my head to do all of these in different steps, but go ahead and just throw it all in a pot if you wanted to. Now, Eric's recipe did call for sliced onions, which I'm really glad it did, so I loaded this thing up with sliced onions because once they cook, they will add a little bit of sweetness to the dish. Not as much as gochujang would have, but at least there would be some layering of flavor here. Now, when I tasted it, it honestly really did taste like a Mapo tofu stew, but it also contained the really bright high notes that the kimchi has brought to it. And it was all really brought together by how comforting eating it this way was. The last touch here was to top it off with 2 tablespoons of homemade toasted chili oil, which is a lot less than you would have in the tofu dish, but since you're eating this as a stew, you don't want too much fat to be in there. Now, to enjoy either of the dishes, you have to eat it with rice. Not only does it calm everything down, but it adds a little bit of mildness to counteract all the flavors that you are adding to it. It brings balance to the whole thing and makes it so that you can't stop eating. Take a spoonful of rice and then layer it with whatever you want from the stew, and then dip it so that the stew absorbs into the rice a little, and then just take it in one glorious bite. Obviously, this is a very spicy dish. I'm not going to combine Szechuan and Korean cooking and not make you something spicy. Giving you a vegetarian or vegan way to prepare this dish is no problem, but giving you a mild version of this, I just don't see a point in doing it at all. Honestly, this dish was absolutely delicious. I felt like I was being brought back to life as I was eating it. I hope you give this dish a try, especially if you have a lot of experience with either the stew or the tofu dishes. Is it really different? Is it really familiar? Just let me know in the comments.